Shalom, shalom, everyone. Look forward to continuing our learning today of the Sefer HaChinuch, our list of the Taryag Mitzvot, the 613 Mitzvot. And today we're going to continue with Mitzvot 5 to 8 related to the Korban Pesach. And the truth is 5 to 23 all deal with Pesach matters. And I wanted to save it for these few weeks leading up to Passover so that we could focus on them at the best possible time. So this is an exciting time of year as we are thinking about the holiday and preparing for the holiday. And some of these mitzvot may seem a bit archaic or alienating, but I think looking at some of the deeper meaning, we can tap into some profound ideas to make Pesach more meaningful for us. So as always, I hope if you have questions or thoughts, you will post them here so that we can engage in some learning together. So mitzvot 5 to 8, all dealing with the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering. Mitzvah 5, mitzvah shechitat haPesach, the mitzvah of the Passover offering itself. Okay, of the shechita, of the actual killing of the animal. Because it says over here in Shemot 12:6, in Exodus 12:6, V'shachatu oto kol kahal adat Yisrael bein harbayim. Right? We see here that the whole community of Israel shall slay the animal in the afternoon. Okay, so the very first mitzvah here is the shechita itself. Okay, then if you look at mitzvah 6, it's achilat basar haPesach. If you look at Exodus 12:8, it says va'achlu et habasar balayla hazeh. So the first mitzvah is the shechita. The second mitzvah is the eating of the offering. The third mitzvah shelo le'achol haPesach na umevushal, that we should not eat the Passover offering slightly roasted or cooked. Okay, because we learn over there in Exodus 12:9. Al tochlu memenu na uvashel mevushal b'mayim ki im tzli. Right, that there's a prohibition against eating it slightly roasted or cooked. Okay, then number 4, or more properly number 8, as listed here in the Sefer HaChinuch, is shelo lahotir mibsar haPesach, not to leave over any of the flesh of the Passover offering. V'lo totiru mimenu ad boker, not to leave it over till the morning. Exodus 12:10. So again, we see here in mitzvot 5, the mitzvah of shchitat Pesach. Mitzvah 6 is the eating of the Passover offering. Mitzvah 7, the prohibition against eating a Pesach offering which is slightly roasted or cooked. And then mitzvah 8, not to leave over any of this Pesach offering. Okay, so what is this all about? Because this is really, really central to the Pesach experience as listed in the Torah and throughout the rabbinic tradition. So what does the Sefer HaChinuch say? Misharshe mitzvazo k'dei sheyizkor leYehudim leolam hanisim hagadolim she'asa lehem Hashem b'yetziat Mitzrayim. At the root of all of this is that the Klal Yisrael, the Jews, should remember the great nisim, the great miracles, which God did for them at Yetziat Mitzrayim, the leaving of Egypt. So, according to the Sefer Chinuch, what is this all about? Based on many earlier sources, is that the Korban Pesach is about remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim. Remember that we're leaving, and it says if you choose not to partake in this, it's an Isser Karet, right? It's a prohibition. It's of a very high degree of divine severance of existence. Karet, very, very serious, as we learn from Bamidbar 9:13. Isser of Karet. Okay, so what is this all about? He continues on a little bit further over here in Mitzvah 7, that we eat the Pesach offering to commemorate we went out into freedom. We went l'cheirut, lihiot mamlechet kohanim ve'am kadosh. We went out of Egypt. Not only that we went out of Egypt, but that we also went towards freedom, right? Not just negative freedom of leaving bondage, but positive freedom, moving towards our actualization, l'cheirut lihiyot mamlechet kohanim va'am kadosh, in order that we could be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, as we see in Shmot 19:6, Exodus 19:6. And he says there, then it is certainly fitting for us to behave while eating it in the manner of freedom and lordship. Not a great translation. Derech cherut v'sarut, in a way of freedom and privilege, perhaps. So we see here these four mitzvot around the Passover offering. And the reason given is that we are trying to have a moral and spiritual consciousness about freedom. Remembering that we were slaves, remembering there still are slaves today, remembering the power of suffering and oppression in the world, and to understand our role as Jews based upon our historical experience, to be aware of the ger, of the immigrant and refugee and those who are oppressed, so that we can be advocates for them based on our experience. And the Korban Pesach is partially about cultivating the gratitude towards God for that historical experience and for the freedom that comes each day into our lives, and also that we should be leaders to fight against injustice and oppression. Now, so the idea is that this ritual slaughter takes place on Erev Pesach, the day before leading up to Passover, and then you eat it on the first night of Passover with the maror, with the bitter herbs, and with the matzah. And according to the Torah, this korban was brought, it was offered on the night that the Israelites left Egypt. That as they're leaving, they did this. And the blood of this sacrifice is what was sprinkled on the doorposts, famously, as a sign to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when passing these houses and slaying the firstborn of the Mitzrim, of the Egyptians, to pass over, essentially, our homes. As we see here in Shemot 12, if you look at the 12th chapter of Exodus. And this is why we call the Passover of Egypt Pesach Mitzrayim, as it's called in the Mishnah Pesachim. And we call this Pesach Dorot in the Mishnah also, that this is something that wasn't just historical, but something that should continue. That just as they did this, so too we should do this. Now it's interesting that Rashi notes in Bamidbar 9:1, in Numbers chapter 9, verse 1, that only once during the 40 years in the desert, only once in those 40 years, did they do this? That 1 year after the Exodus, they offered this Korban Pesach. But that the next 39 years after that, there was no offering. And the idea here was that it wasn't until they entered Eretz Yisrael, till they entered the land of Israel, that they would start bringing the Pesach sacrifice once again. So the desert doesn't happen, and that it's connected to entering according to Rashi. Now, the question emerges today with some urgency for some around whether we should be doing this now. Now, if you look at the Amek Davar, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, great thinker, a Volozhin, 19th century Volozhin, what he says here in Devarim 16:3 is worth looking at. He basically says it's forbidden to bring korbanot. It is we're not allowed to bring animal sacrifices without the mikdash, without the temple, because it is described as a pleasing aroma, as it says over there in Leviticus 26:31, over in Vayikra 26:31. But then it says, and it says over here in the end of the 4th chapter in, bracket that, but that essentially it says over there in the Gemara, I want to just check that source, I'll post it below later, that the sacrifice must be for the sake of the aroma, and for the sake that the aroma is itself pleasing. And sacrifices brought in the wrong time, at the wrong place, are not pleasing. And so the only exception to that, interesting enough, is the Korban Pesach. The Amek Davar says here that it is not brought for the sake of a pleasing aroma. Therefore, it can be brought after the Korban, after the destruction of the temple, as long as there's Mizbeach, as long as there's an altar. So anyone could build an altar, even when there's not a Bayit Shlishi, a third temple, is part of the idea here in the Amak Davar, that this can be done. Now, there's many who are urgent today to return to this practice of Korban Pesach, that it's an authentic Torah, and now that we have sovereignty in Israel and Yerushalayim and Jerusalem, that we should return to this. In fact, in 2007, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz and the Temple Mount Faithful and the New Sanhedrin Council actually identified a Cohen who was a butcher, who was a shochet, and they made plans to do this on the Temple Mount over there in Jerusalem. And they even petitioned the High Court of Justice for permission to do this, because obviously they couldn't just go and do this. This would be a very contentious thing. And the court sided with the government, and they rejected this request to start bringing a Passover offering over at the Temple Mount. And the argument primarily was that it would lead to significant religious tensions and would threaten security, which is undoubtedly true. If you look at the last few years, the desire is even increasing. If you look at 2016, for example, these activists who are really pushing for a Bayit Shlishi, a third temple in Jerusalem, to be built on the Temple Mount, come into Jerusalem, in the Old City, and they're carrying baby goats. Generally, the police detain these suspects. In 2016, they detained 10 suspects in the Old City for interrogation, and they seized their sacrificial goats. They brought many sacrificial goat kids that they wanted to kill in the interest of being a Korban Pesach. But if you look at the recent years also, they're not just being denied in the Old City. They're still doing this. There's hundreds of them who are practicing the sacrifice. In fact, I'll post an article or two below where you can see a little bit more here about what's happening. And this is something we should learn more about and understand the strong desires some hold to return to Mitzvah 5, 6, 7, 8 of the 613 in the most literal way. Personally, it's my belief that this is a very dangerous idea, not only because of the political tensions, which are not a small bit, and the conflict that would emerge between Jews and Muslims, between Israelis and Palestinians, but also because of the strong desire to once again kill animals in the name of God, which made a lot of sense actually in ancient society, when this was the extent of property you had, and you really made a sacrifice by giving an animal, elevating an animal towards God. It was really a very powerful religious experience. But to try to return to that today seems very problematic religiously. And it's a lack of creativity that we only look to return towards ancient societies rather than seeking to serve God in the most powerful and meaningful ways today. And so I believe we should continue to resist and should support the Israeli government's resistance against those who are trying to get onto the Temple Mount to engage in animal sacrifice for a whole host of reasons. And so what do we do today? We have a Pesach Seder. And at the Seder, we remember the Korban Pesach, right? We have Zroa. And at Zroa, people put this roasted bone with a little bit of meat still remaining on it. However, it's not eaten, of course. And so this Zecher, this remembrance of the Korban Pesach, is a part of the Passover experience itself, to commemorate that. Now, what do us vegans do? We, of course, replace those items that are animal products on the Seder plate. Most commonly, the bone, the zroa, is replaced with a beet, with an uncooked slice of beet, and the egg is replaced with a mushroom. But there's various approaches that are taken here, and I can also post something below about that issue. So what's the deeper meaning that we're engaged in here? Because I think there's a tension. On the one hand, I think we want to preserve the power and the importance of this idea of Korban Pesach, that we want to bring an offering to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim, both because it's formative to our national identity and also because it gives us the moral mandate to go out and stand for justice and stand with the ger, stand with the stranger and the immigrant and the refugee and the downtrodden, because this is a big part of what the Pesach remembrance is about. And all of this geared towards cultivating a gratitude for our existence and towards God for our freedom and to continue to spread that freedom. But another virtue is chesed, is kindness. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, in the book The Seder Night, Festival of Freedom, he writes, the birth of a chesed community, of a nation within which people unite, give things away, care for each other, share what they possess, is symbolized by the Paschal sacrifice. God did not need the Paschal lamb, of course. It's absurd, the idea that God needs meat from us. He says he had no interest in the sacrifice. He simply wanted the people, slaves who had just come out of the house of bondage, to emerge from their isolation and insane self-centeredness into the chesed community, into the kindness, the loving community, where the little that man has is too much for himself. That the little bit that we have is yet too much for ourselves. And so Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying here that a big message of the Passover offering, of the Korban Pesach, is the idea of giving, of sharing, right? That we should invite people to our Seder. We should, at this time of year, think about financial contributions. We should look to lift up those around us who need lifting up. And that the Korban Pesach is there to remind us that even at a time where the Israelites coming out of slavery had so little, they were still willing to give. I'm reminded of the story written by, the author's name will come back to me in a moment. Primo Levi. Primo Levi writes that the most difficult time in Auschwitz was the brief period after the Nazis had left and before the Soviets arrived, because there was no order, there was no structure. And there was confusion about the future, and obviously still a lot of pain and suffering. And then a man found a sack of potatoes, he writes. And what any starving person would have done would have been to eat the potatoes. But instead, Primo Levi took the potatoes and ran to the center square and started passing them out. And crying, he said, "This is the first time I'm once again human, because this is the first time I'm able to give to another person in years." That in fact, what's constitutive of our humanity, what makes us human beings, is our power of giving others. When a baby is born with their hands closed, as if to say, I don't know that I need anyone. But everyone who dies, if you've seen a person die, they die with their hands open, which is to say, I'm completely aware how dependent I am upon God and upon others for my well-being. And so we learn the power of chesed, that it's not just a nice thing to do kind acts. It's what makes us human. It's our mission. It's our raison d'etre. It's our purpose for being, is to look to do kind deeds. Okay, so we're looking here at the meanings of Korban Pesach. We looked at some of the halachot, some of the various rules, although there's tons of detail here if you look more deeply into 5 through 8 around the historical experience of Korban Pesach. But now we're looking at the deeper meaning. So Rabbi Soloveitchik talks about the chesed, about the kindness aspect here. And now we're going to look at Rav Shlomo Wolbe. Rav Shlomo Wolbe, the great 20th century teacher of Musar. He has 2 different points here that we're going to look at. One is around desire. And what he wants to say here is that one should eat with desire rather than eating for the sake of desire, right? One eats to enjoy, one eats to get hungry. Incorrect. Rather, one desires food. More importantly, they desire energy, they desire connection, and so they consume. Here's what he says. We see that eating matzah with an appetite is an enhancement of the mitzvah, whereas one who eats the Korban Pesach for the sake of excessive consumption is a sinner. One who is overly zealous to consume and overconsume, this is a sin, Rav Shlomo Wolbe says. The distinction is clear. Eating without an appetite is not called eating at all. And the more one increases their desire, the more they've enhanced the mitzvah of matzah. But Rabbi bar Bar Chana considered a person eating solely to fulfill his desires a sinner, even if the eating itself is a mitzvah, right? So we see here this idea that when one is only driven by desire, whether it's hedonism or just any form of pleasure or a form of or ego, one is driven by a self-fulfillment. That even when it comes to Korban Pesach, this is not a mitzvah, this is a sin. Rather, one's intentions should be to fulfill eating with desire, that our eating experience should have a spiritual and moral component to it that uplifts us. And so the ideal with Korban Pesach and the Seder night is not just that we're eating good food. It's already very difficult to make good Pesach food. But that not just that we're eating good food, but that we're eating in a way to gain a moral and spiritual consciousness about our mission in the world, right? In fact, the entire Seder is about that. Remember you were slaves in Egypt. Remember your mandate today. Remember to cultivate gratitude. Remember to live according to these central values, right? And the Korban Pesach is the vehicle throughout history that continues to serve as this reminder of what consumption is all about. Because for many, consumption can merely be, what is the best tasting stuff I can eat, right? But this is a very low level of consumption. A higher religious, spiritual form of consumption is consuming to serve God, to increase chesed, increase kindness and love and peace into the world, to give oneself energy to fulfill one's mission. So Rav Shlomo Volbe here in Alei Shor, volume 1, page 217, talks about how the Korban Pesach is teaching us about what to do with desire and what to do with consuming in the best way possible. In fact, much of our loneliness, our social loneliness, and our lack of mission is part of what is the problem of overconsumption today. The people eat very poorly, they buy things very poorly, we overconsume, we overeat. And part of this is that we're spiritually bored, we're socially isolated and alienated. And so we fill ourselves with stuff to feel like we're full when in fact we're empty. So if we fill ourselves with a deeper consciousness, many people think that diets are about limiting. But in fact, the most effective form of thinking about food consumption is not just about limiting. It's about filling ourselves with otherness, filling ourselves with ideas, with spirituality, with connection in a way that replaces other forms of lower desire. Okay, here's the last point, also from Rav Shlomo Volbe, the great teacher of Musar in the 20th century, around zrizut, around alacrity. He says, the performance of mitzvah done consciously is an action upon which the divine presence dwells. We find this regarding the Korban Pesach, that we were commanded, you shall eat it in a hurry, chipazon. And in the Mechilta, there's the same language regarding the divine presence. The divine presence hurries without any delay. So to emulate the Shekhinah, to emulate divine presence, and to emulate the experience of how this was eaten leaving Egypt, we want to eat this quickly, right? Which we don't normally want to do. We want to eat slowly, intentionally. But here is the case for zrizut, of how to live slowly and thoughtfully, but to live with urgency. Sometimes we see one or the other. We see those who are very slow, don't have a sense of moral, spiritual urgency. Everything is, they're very hesitant towards those who want to move fast. And we see the other degree, those who always want to move quickly without any thoughtfulness or intentionality. And the challenge is to be both quick and slow, to be both, feel a sense of urgency of what we're doing, but to continue to do that with thoughtfulness and intentionality. Very few people master that combination. Usually people are in the slow, non-urgent camp, or they're in the unthoughtful, urgent camp. And I think our challenge, and I think this is what a lot of Torah learning is about, is that we should be activists, we should be change makers, we should live with urgency, but we should do that with deep spiritual consciousness and intentionality. And so Rav Shlomo Volbe is saying Korban Pesach is a reminder of zrizut, right? You're told to leave Egypt, you go right away. Right? Today, we see injustice, we got to respond right away. We see an opportunity to lift someone up, to bring light into the world, we need to do it right away. And so, to sum up what we've done so far, and again, if anyone has any closing questions or thoughts here, feel free to comment them here. But essentially, the idea that that in the 613 biblical mitzvot, 5 says shchitat Pesach, 6 says the eating of the Pesach. The 7 says not to eat the slightly roasted or cooked Pesach. And then number 8 says not to leave over any of it. And we see that this is historically with a temple period of how we think about the eating of an animal sacrifice. And today, rather than engaging in animal sacrifice, which as we saw itself would be forbidden to engage in animal sacrifice today in general, that we need to cultivate deeper meaning. And the deeper meaning of Korban Pesach we shouldn't abandon just because of its historical manifestation, but rather the Seder experience and everything leading up to the Seder experience should help us to cultivate what Rabbi Soloveitchik said about Korban Pesach, the power of chesed, of love and giving, of sacrifice. And then we saw from Rabbi Shlomo Volbe the power of spiritual and moral consciousness of consumption, and also of zrizut, of holding on to urgency. So as we prepare in these few weeks leading up to Pesach, I wish everyone wonderful preparation, because the truth is more important than Seder night is the weeks preparing. Our studying, our cleaning, our learning, our mitzvot connected to ending modern day slavery and modern day oppression. And the Seder then is the pinnacle of experience, that if we prepared well, it can be a spiritual actualization of those moral values. And so we should understand the Korban Pesach in its own important ways in the 21st century without abandoning its historical meaning, but also looking forward to bring societal progress, to bring spiritual development, and to fulfill the moral mission of Klal Yisrael in the world. Have a wonderful day.